October 15th, 1987, Capitol Hill, Seattle, Washington. The autumn rain fell steadily on the cobblestone streets of Capitol Hill as Robert Mitchell turned the key in the front door of Groove Archives for what would be the final time. The vintage record store, nestled between a coffee shop and a used bookstore on Pine Street, had been his passion project for nearly a decade. At 42 years old, Robert had built a reputation among music enthusiasts as someone who could find the impossible: rare pressings, unreleased demos, and forgotten gems from the golden age of vinyl. That Thursday evening seemed no different from countless others. Sarah Coleman, his part-time employee, had left at 6 o'clock after helping close the register. She remembered Robert mentioning he would stay late to organize some new arrivals that had come in that afternoon. The store's atmosphere was typical for an October evening. The warm glow of amber lighting illuminated rows upon rows of carefully cataloged records, from classic rock to obscure jazz imports. Jennifer Mitchell expected her husband home by 8:30, as was his routine. When 9 o'clock passed without his arrival, she called the store. The phone rang endlessly, echoing through the empty shop. By 10:15, concern had transformed into genuine worry. Robert was methodical about his schedules, particularly on weeknights when he preferred to be home for dinner with Jennifer and their teenage daughter, Amanda. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when Jennifer drove to the store at 11 o'clock. Robert's blue 1984 Honda Civic sat in the narrow alley behind the building, keys still dangling from the ignition. The engine was cold, suggesting it had been parked for hours. More disturbing was the fact that the car doors were unlocked, completely unlike Robert, who was notoriously careful about security after a break-in at a neighboring business 6 months earlier. The front door of Groove Archives was properly locked, deadbolt engaged, and the security system activated. Nothing appeared disturbed from the street view. The cash register, visible through the window, seemed untouched. This detail would later prove significant to investigators, as robbery was immediately ruled out as a motive. Jennifer contacted the Seattle Police Department at 11:45 that night. Officer Timothy Rodriguez responded to what was initially classified as a routine missing person call. However, Rodriguez noted several immediate inconsistencies that elevated the case's priority level. The abandoned vehicle with keys in the ignition, combined with Robert's established patterns of behavior, suggested this was not a voluntary disappearance. The initial investigation revealed that Robert had indeed been at the store until at least 7:30 that evening. Margaret Wilson, who owned the coffee shop next door, remembered seeing lights on in Groove Archives when she left work. She specifically recalled noticing Robert moving around inside, though she couldn't see clearly through the window displays. What made Robert's disappearance particularly puzzling was his recent behavior in the weeks leading up to October 15th. According to Sarah Coleman, her employer had become increasingly preoccupied with a particular acquisition he was pursuing. He had mentioned receiving calls about an extremely rare recording, something he described as potentially the most significant find of his career. The recording in question was allegedly an unreleased demo tape from a local Seattle band called The Echoing Void, which had briefly existed in the mid-1960s. The band had recorded only a handful of tracks before dissolving due to internal conflicts. What made this particular demo valuable was not just its rarity, but the circumstances surrounding its creation. The session had taken place at a small studio that later became famous for recording several major acts before their breakthrough moments. Sarah recalled that Robert had become noticeably nervous about this potential acquisition. He had started checking the store's locks multiple times before leaving each evening, and had even mentioned considering upgrading the security system. When asked about his concerns, Robert had been vague, saying only that there were other collectors interested in the same material. The financial records from Groove Archives showed that Robert had been carefully managing the store's cash flow in preparation for a significant purchase. Bank statements revealed he had withdrawn $8,000 in cash over the previous 2 weeks, an unusual amount for someone who typically conducted business through checks and credit transactions. Detective William Parker was assigned to the case on October 16th. Parker, a 15-year veteran of the Seattle Police Department, had experience with missing persons cases, but found several elements of Robert's disappearance particularly concerning. The combination of the abandoned vehicle, the careful preparation for a major purchase, and Robert's recent behavioral changes suggested this was not a simple case of someone walking away from their responsibilities. The investigation's first major breakthrough came when Parker examined the store's phone records. In the 3 weeks preceding Robert's disappearance, Groove Archives had received an unusual number of calls from unlisted numbers. Most of these calls had occurred during business hours, but several had come in during evening hours when the store was typically closed. Parker's interview with Jennifer Mitchell provided additional context about her husband's state of mind. She confirmed that Robert had been excited about a potential acquisition, but had been reluctant to discuss details. He had mentioned that the negotiation process was complicated and involved multiple parties. Jennifer also noted that Robert had recently begun carrying more cash than usual, something that had concerned her given the increase in street crime in the Capitol Hill area. The search of Groove Archives yielded few immediate clues. The store's inventory appeared complete, with no obvious gaps that might suggest theft. Robert's personal office, located in a small room behind the main retail space, showed signs of recent organization. Files were neatly arranged, and his desk was unusually clean for someone known to be somewhat disorganized with paperwork. However, one detail caught Detective Parker's attention. The store's safe, located beneath the cash register, had been opened recently. Jennifer confirmed that Robert rarely accessed the safe except for end-of-month banking deposits. When opened by police, the safe contained the expected items: backup cash, important business documents, and a few particularly valuable records that Robert kept secured. What was missing, according to Sarah Coleman, was a manila envelope that Robert had placed in the safe approximately 1 week before his disappearance. Sarah remembered this specifically because Robert had been secretive about its contents, telling her only that it contained information related to his potential acquisition. As the first week of investigation concluded, Detective Parker found himself facing a mystery that seemed to deepen with each new piece of information. Robert Mitchell had vanished from a locked building, leaving behind his vehicle, his business, and a family who insisted he would never voluntarily abandon his responsibilities. The missing envelope suggested that Robert's disappearance was connected to his recent business activities, but the exact nature of that connection remained unclear. The case was about to take an even more disturbing turn when investigators discovered that Robert Mitchell was not the only collector who had recently gone missing while pursuing rare musical recordings. October 1987, Seattle Police Department Detective William Parker's investigation into Robert Mitchell's disappearance expanded significantly when a routine cross-reference search revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the previous 18 months, 3 other record collectors from the Pacific Northwest had vanished under circumstances that shared troubling similarities with Robert's case. Each had been pursuing rare or unreleased recordings, each had withdrawn significant amounts of cash shortly before disappearing, and each had left behind vehicles in unusual locations. The first case involved Michael Stevens, a 47-year-old collector from Portland, Oregon, who had disappeared in March 1986. Stevens had been negotiating for a collection of unreleased Jimi Hendrix studio outtakes when he vanished from a hotel parking lot. His rental car was found with the engine running and his wallet on the front seat. The Portland Police Department had classified the case as a probable robbery gone wrong, but no arrests had been made. Thomas Bradley, a 38-year-old music journalist and collector from Tacoma, had disappeared in January 1987 while investigating the existence of lost recordings from a 1960s folk revival band. His car was discovered 3 days later in a shopping center parking lot, 20 miles from where he was last seen. Like Robert, Bradley had withdrawn substantial cash before his disappearance and had been secretive about his recent activities. The third case proved most relevant to Robert's situation. Daniel Foster, a record store owner from Bellingham, had vanished in August 1987, just 2 months before Robert. Foster had been pursuing the acquisition of what he claimed were original master tapes from a defunct recording studio. His store had been found locked and secure, with no signs of struggle or theft. Foster's vehicle was located in a remote area near the Canadian border, abandoned but undamaged. Detective Parker contacted the investigating officers from each case and discovered that none of the 3 departments had considered the possibility of a connection. The geographic spread of the disappearances and the different local jurisdictions had prevented anyone from recognizing the pattern. More significantly, each victim had been involved in negotiations for materials allegedly connected to the same source, a mysterious individual known only as the collector. Sarah Coleman's second interview with Detective Parker provided crucial information about this shadowy figure. She recalled that Robert had mentioned receiving contact from someone who claimed to represent a private collector interested in selling parts of an extensive archive. This individual had never provided a full name, identifying himself only as an intermediary for someone who preferred to remain anonymous due to the sensitive nature of the materials. According to Sarah, Robert had been initially skeptical of these contacts. He had built his reputation on legitimate acquisitions and was wary of anything that seemed questionable. However, the intermediary had provided photographs and detailed documentation that appeared to authenticate the material's legitimacy. The potential value of the recordings had eventually overcome Robert's caution. The investigation took on new urgency when Jennifer Mitchell revealed that she had continued receiving phone calls at home even after Robert's disappearance. The caller never spoke, but would remain on the line for several seconds before hanging up. These calls always came between 9 and 10 in the evening, and always from different phone numbers. Jennifer had initially attributed them to wrong numbers or prank calls, but their frequency and timing suggested a more sinister purpose. Detective Parker arranged for a tap on the Mitchell family phone, hoping to trace the source of these mysterious calls. The first trapped call came on October 23rd, exactly 1 week after Robert's disappearance. The number traced to a payphone in downtown Seattle, but by the time officers arrived at the location, no one was present. However, the payphone's location proved significant. It was less than 2 blocks from a building that housed several businesses dealing in rare books, antiques, and collectibles. The building at 1247 First Avenue became a focal point of the investigation when Detective Parker discovered that representatives of at least 2 of the missing collectors had visited businesses in this location. Michael Stevens had met with someone at Antiquarian Books and Manuscripts just days before his disappearance in Portland. Daniel Foster had been scheduled to meet a contact at Vintage Treasures and Collectibles on the day he vanished from Bellingham. Charles Thompson, the owner of Vintage Treasures and Collectibles, initially claimed no knowledge of any missing collectors. However, when confronted with evidence that Foster had been scheduled to meet someone at his store, Thompson's story changed. He admitted that he occasionally acted as an intermediary for private collectors who preferred to remain anonymous. Thompson insisted that these arrangements were legitimate business transactions and expressed shock at learning about the disappearances. Thompson's business records showed a pattern of unusual activity in the months leading up to each disappearance. Large cash transactions had been recorded, often followed by immediate withdrawals of the same amounts. When pressed for details about his anonymous clients, Thompson claimed he had only ever communicated with them through a post office box and occasional phone calls from payphones. The post office box in question was registered under the name Archival Services, LLC, a company that investigation revealed to be a shell corporation with no physical address or identifiable owners. The registration had been paid for in cash, and the listed phone number had been disconnected shortly after Robert Mitchell's disappearance. Detective Parker's analysis of the timeline revealed another disturbing pattern. Each of the 4 disappearances had occurred during periods when valuable recording collections were being sold at estate auctions in the region. These auctions often attracted serious collectors from across the country, creating an environment where large cash transactions and secretive negotiations were commonplace. The investigation expanded to include Dr. Amanda Richardson, a professor of musicology at the University of Washington who specialized in the history of Pacific Northwest recording studios. Dr. Richardson confirmed that there had indeed been a significant amount of unreleased material produced by local studios in the 1960s and early 1970s. Much of this material had been lost or destroyed when smaller studios went out of business, making any surviving recordings extremely valuable to collectors. What made Dr. Richardson's information particularly relevant was her knowledge of a specific studio that had operated in Seattle from 1965 to 1973. Soundwave Studios had recorded numerous local bands, some of which later achieved national success. When the studio closed, its archives had been sold to a private buyer whose identity had never been publicly disclosed. Dr. Richardson suspected that these archives might be the source of the recordings that had attracted the missing collectors. Property records showed that Soundwave Studios' former location had been purchased by a real estate development company in 1974. However, the company's records indicated that the building's contents, including all recording equipment and archived materials, had been sold separately to an individual buyer. This buyer had paid in cash and had specified that his identity remain confidential as part of the purchase agreement. The trail of the mysterious buyer led Detective Parker to a series of property transfers and business registrations that formed a complex web of shell companies and false identities. Each transaction had been carefully structured to obscure the ultimate ownership of the materials, suggesting a level of planning and sophistication that elevated the case beyond simple theft or fraud. As October drew to a close, Detective Parker found himself investigating what appeared to be an organized operation targeting collectors of rare musical recordings. The pattern suggested that someone with detailed knowledge of the collector community was systematically identifying individuals interested in specific materials, luring them into isolated situations, and then eliminating them. The investigation was about to take an even darker turn when forensic analysis of evidence from the various crime scenes revealed traces of a substance that would change everything investigators thought they knew about these disappearances. November 2nd, 1987, Washington State Crime Laboratory. The forensic breakthrough that would transform Detective Parker's investigation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a toxicologist at the Washington State Crime Laboratory, discovered microscopic traces of an unusual chemical compound while analyzing fabric samples from Daniel Foster's abandoned vehicle. The substance, identified as a rare industrial cleaning agent called trichloroethane-based solvent, was not commercially available to the general public and required special licensing to obtain. What made this discovery particularly significant was that the same compound was found in trace amounts on items recovered from all 4 crime scenes. Michael Stevens's rental car contained residual traces on the door handles. Thomas Bradley's vehicle showed similar contamination on the steering wheel. Most importantly, Robert Mitchell's Honda Civic tested positive for the substance on both the driver's seat fabric and the keys that had been left in the ignition. The chemical compound's restricted availability provided investigators with their first concrete lead. Records from the Washington State Department of Ecology showed that only 12 businesses in the Pacific Northwest region held valid licenses to purchase and use this particular solvent. The substance was primarily employed in specialized equipment cleaning operations, particularly for sensitive electronic devices and recording equipment. Among the licensed businesses, one name immediately caught Detective Parker's attention: Northwest Audio Restoration Services, operated by a man named Anthony Rodriguez. The company's registered address was a warehouse facility in the Georgetown district of Seattle, less than 10 miles from where Robert Mitchell's store was located. More significantly, the business specialized in cleaning and restoring vintage recording equipment and master tapes. Rodriguez's background revealed a complex history within the music industry. A former sound engineer who had worked at several major recording studios during the 1970s, he had established his restoration business in 1982 after being dismissed from his position at a prominent Nashville studio under circumstances that his former employers refused to discuss in detail. The investigation into Rodriguez's business activities uncovered a sophisticated operation that extended far beyond simple audio restoration. Financial records showed that Northwest Audio Restoration Services had been receiving substantial payments from the mysterious Archival Services LLC that had been linked to the missing collectors. These transactions, totaling over $200,000 over the previous 2 years, were recorded as payments for specialized restoration work on historical recording materials. More disturbing was the discovery that Rodriguez had been systematically acquiring recording equipment and archived materials from defunct studios throughout the region. His purchases included the complete contents of at least 6 closed recording facilities, transactions that had been conducted through intermediaries to obscure his identity as the buyer. The Soundwave Studios archive that Dr. Richardson had mentioned was among these acquisitions. Detective Parker's surveillance of the Georgetown warehouse revealed unusual patterns of activity. The facility operated primarily during evening and weekend hours, with vehicles arriving and departing at irregular intervals. License plate checks showed that several of the vehicles belonged to individuals with criminal records related to theft and fraud. Most significantly, one of the frequent visitors was Charles Thompson, the antique dealer who had claimed minimal involvement in the missing collector cases. The surveillance operation intensified when investigators observed Rodriguez meeting with an individual who matched the physical description provided by witnesses who had seen someone with Robert Mitchell on the day of his disappearance. The meeting took place in a parking lot adjacent to the warehouse, with both men maintaining a distance that suggested extreme caution about being observed or overheard. A breakthrough in understanding the scope of the operation came when Detective Parker obtained a warrant to search Rodriguez's business premises. The warehouse contained an extensive collection of vintage recording equipment, including several complete studio setups that appeared to be fully operational. However, the most significant discovery was a sophisticated counterfeiting operation designed to produce fake vintage recordings. The equipment found in the warehouse could create artificial aging effects on new recordings, making them appear to be authentic vintage materials. Chemical treatments, specialized printing equipment for labels, and even artificial wear patterns for vinyl records demonstrated a level of sophistication that explained how the operation had been able to fool experienced collectors with fake documentation and photographs. The investigation revealed that Rodriguez had been using legitimate rare recordings as templates to create convincing forgeries. The process required access to original materials for reference, which explained the systematic targeting of collectors who possessed authentic rare recordings. Once Rodriguez had obtained the originals through deception or theft, he could produce multiple copies while selling the forgeries to unsuspecting buyers at premium prices. Financial analysis of the operation showed that Rodriguez had generated millions of dollars through the sale of counterfeit recordings over a 5-year period. The buyers included private collectors, auction houses, and even some legitimate record stores that had unknowingly purchased and resold the fake materials. The scale of the fraud extended across multiple states and involved dozens of transactions. The connection between the counterfeiting operation and the missing collectors became clear when investigators discovered detailed files containing personal information about each victim. Rodriguez had been systematically researching collectors who owned specific recordings that he needed for his forgery templates. The files included financial information, personal schedules, and detailed notes about each collector's areas of interest and typical purchasing patterns. Most chilling was the discovery of what appeared to be a target list containing the names of additional collectors who had been marked for future contact. Robert Mitchell's name appeared on this list, along with detailed notes about his store's inventory and his reputation for acquiring rare recordings. The list contained over 30 names, suggesting that the operation had been planning to continue expanding its victim base. The evidence indicated that the missing collectors had not simply been robbed of their recordings. They had been specifically targeted because their knowledge and expertise posed a threat to the counterfeiting operation. Each victim had possessed the expertise to potentially identify the sophisticated forgeries that Rodriguez was producing, making them dangerous witnesses who needed to be eliminated. Detective Parker's analysis of the timeline revealed that each disappearance had occurred shortly after the respective collector had been contacted about purchasing specific recordings that Rodriguez needed for his templates. The elaborate deception involving anonymous sellers and intermediaries had been designed to lure the collectors into isolated situations where they could be eliminated without witnesses. The investigation was entering its most critical phase when surveillance teams observed Rodriguez preparing to abandon the warehouse operation. The urgency of the situation was heightened by the discovery that several names on the target list had been recently contacted using the same deceptive methods that had been employed with the missing collectors. As investigators prepared to move against Rodriguez and his network, they uncovered evidence that would reveal the true scope of a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond simple fraud and into territory that would shock even experienced law enforcement professionals. November 15, 1987, Georgetown Warehouse District, Seattle. The operation to apprehend Anthony Rodriguez and dismantle his criminal network required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. Detective Parker worked closely with FBI agent Jessica Morgan, whose expertise in organized crime proved invaluable as the investigation revealed connections that extended far beyond the Pacific Northwest region. The scale of the counterfeiting operation had attracted federal attention due to its interstate commerce implications and the sophisticated money laundering schemes that supported it. Surveillance teams positioned around the Georgetown warehouse documented increasingly frantic activity as Rodriguez and his associates appeared to be preparing for a hasty departure. Equipment was being loaded into trucks, and several individuals with known criminal backgrounds were observed removing boxes of materials from the facility. The urgency of these activities suggested that the criminal organization had become aware of the police investigation. The decision to move against the warehouse came when intercepted communications revealed that Rodriguez was planning to meet with another collector within 48 hours. The potential victim, identified as Gregory Patterson from Vancouver, British Columbia, had been contacted using the same deceptive methods employed with the missing collectors. Patterson had agreed to meet Rodriguez at a remote location to examine what he believed were authentic, unreleased Beatles studio sessions. The coordinated raid on the warehouse facility began at dawn on November 15th. Multiple teams simultaneously approached the building from different directions to prevent escape attempts. The operation's complexity was heightened by the need to preserve evidence of the counterfeiting operation while ensuring the safety of any potential victims who might be held at the location. Inside the warehouse, investigators discovered a scene that exceeded their worst expectations. Beyond the sophisticated counterfeiting equipment, they found clear evidence that the facility had been used for purposes far more sinister than fraud. A section of the building had been converted into what appeared to be a disposal area, complete with industrial chemical equipment and specialized cleaning apparatus. The chemical signature that had provided the initial breakthrough in the investigation was explained by the discovery of extensive cleaning operations designed to eliminate physical evidence. The rare solvent had been used to remove traces of human presence from vehicles and other items before they were abandoned at remote locations. This revelation suggested that the missing collectors had been brought to the warehouse facility before being eliminated. Rodriguez himself was not present during the raid, but 3 associates were arrested at the scene. Among them was Kevin Walsh, a former recording studio technician whose expertise had been crucial to the counterfeiting operation. Walsh's arrest proved significant when investigators discovered that he had maintained detailed records of the operation's activities, apparently as insurance against his partners. The records kept by Walsh revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise. The operation had been active for over 6 years and had victimized at least 14 collectors across multiple states. The 4 Pacific Northwest cases that had initially attracted attention represented only a fraction of the total number of victims. Similar disappearances had occurred in California, Oregon, Nevada, and Colorado, all connected to the same counterfeiting network. More disturbing was the discovery that the operation had evolved over time from simple theft to systematic elimination of witnesses. Early victims had apparently been robbed of their collections and released, but several had later attempted to report the crimes to authorities. The decision to begin eliminating victims had been made when the organization realized that survivors posed an ongoing threat to their operation. The evidence found at the warehouse included detailed financial records showing that the counterfeiting operation had generated over $8 million in revenue. The money had been laundered through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts, with profits distributed among at least 12 individuals across multiple states. The sophistication of the money laundering operation suggested involvement by individuals with professional financial expertise. Among the most shocking discoveries was a collection of personal items belonging to the missing collectors. These items, which included jewelry, identification documents, and personal photographs, had apparently been kept as trophies by the criminal organization. The discovery provided definitive proof that the missing individuals had been victims of foul play rather than voluntary disappearances. The investigation's focus shifted to locating Rodriguez, who had apparently fled the area shortly before the raid. Financial records showed recent large cash withdrawals from accounts associated with the operation, suggesting that escape plans had been activated. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were alerted to be on the lookout for Rodriguez and several other individuals identified as key members of the organization. The search for Rodriguez led investigators to a network of safe houses and storage facilities that the organization had established throughout the region. Each location was carefully chosen to provide both security and access to transportation routes that could facilitate rapid escape. The discovery of these facilities revealed the extent of planning that had gone into creating a criminal enterprise capable of operating across state lines while avoiding detection. At one of the storage facilities, investigators made a discovery that would finally provide answers about the fate of the missing collectors. Hidden beneath a false floor in a storage unit registered under a false name, they found evidence that would confirm the worst fears of the victims' families. The discovery would also provide the key to understanding the full extent of the criminal organization's activities. The evidence included detailed maps marking specific locations throughout the Pacific Northwest, where the organization had disposed of evidence and remains. The maps were annotated with dates and coded references that corresponded to the disappearances of known victims. Most significantly, one of the marked locations was less than 30 miles from Seattle, in a remote forested area that had recently been scheduled for development. As law enforcement agencies prepared to search the locations identified in the maps, they received information that would lead to the final confrontation with Anthony Rodriguez. A tip from an informant revealed that Rodriguez had not fled the region as initially believed, but was hiding in a remote cabin in the Cascade Mountains, apparently planning to retrieve additional evidence before making his final escape. The revelation that Rodriguez remained in the area created an urgent situation for investigators. Intelligence suggested that he was not working alone and that other members of the organization were prepared to help him eliminate any remaining evidence of their crimes. The race to apprehend Rodriguez before he could destroy crucial evidence would determine whether justice could finally be achieved for Robert Mitchell and the other victims of this sophisticated criminal enterprise. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would bring closure to one of the most complex and disturbing criminal cases in Pacific Northwest history, but not before revealing additional secrets that would shock investigators and provide answers to questions that had haunted the families of the missing collectors for years. November 22, 1987, Cascade Mountain Range, Washington State. The manhunt for Anthony Rodriguez intensified as Thanksgiving weekend approached, with law enforcement agencies coordinating the largest search operation in Washington state history. The remote cabin where Rodriguez was believed to be hiding sat at an elevation of 4,000 feet, accessible only by a narrow logging road that had been partially washed out by recent autumn rains. The isolation that made the location attractive to Rodriguez also created significant challenges for the tactical teams preparing to apprehend him. FBI agent Jessica Morgan coordinated the operation from a command post established at the base of the mountain. Intelligence gathered from intercepted communications suggested that Rodriguez was not alone at the cabin and that his associates were prepared to destroy evidence if they detected any law enforcement presence. The operation required extreme caution to prevent the loss of crucial evidence that could provide closure for the families of missing collectors. Meanwhile, forensic teams had begun excavating the sites identified in the maps found at the storage facility. The first location, situated in a densely forested area south of Seattle, yielded immediate results when ground-penetrating radar detected multiple anomalies beneath the surface. The systematic excavation revealed evidence that confirmed the worst fears about the fate of the missing collectors. The excavation sites provided forensic evidence that allowed investigators to establish a definitive timeline of the criminal organization's activities. Soil analysis and other environmental factors indicated that some remains had been buried as early as 1983, suggesting that the operation had been claiming victims for far longer than initially suspected. The evidence also revealed that the organization had used sophisticated methods to conceal their crimes, including chemical treatments designed to accelerate decomposition. Personal effects recovered from the burial sites were matched to missing persons reports from across multiple states. Among the items recovered were Robert Mitchell's distinctive silver watch, which Jennifer had described in detail to investigators, and a unique ring belonging to Michael Stevens that had been mentioned in the Portland Police Department's missing person report. These discoveries provided definitive proof of the victims' fates while offering some measure of closure to their families. The investigation revealed that Rodriguez's criminal enterprise had operated with a level of sophistication that suggested extensive planning and organizational structure. Financial analysis showed that the organization had invested heavily in equipment and facilities designed to support long-term operations. The network included legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering, as well as underground facilities specifically designed for the counterfeiting operation. Intelligence gathered from the arrested associates revealed that Rodriguez had maintained detailed psychological profiles of potential victims. The organization had studied the collector community extensively, identifying individuals whose expertise and collections made them both valuable targets and dangerous witnesses. The profiles included information about personal habits, financial resources, and family situations that could be exploited during the targeting process. The scope of the counterfeiting operation extended far beyond simple reproduction of rare recordings. Investigators discovered that the organization had been creating entirely fictional musical history, complete with fabricated documentation and false provenance records. Some of the counterfeit recordings had been accepted as authentic by major auction houses and had sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars to unsuspecting collectors. The psychological manipulation employed by the organization proved particularly sophisticated. Rodriguez and his associates had studied the psychology of collectors, understanding the obsessive nature that drove individuals to seek rare and unique materials. This knowledge allowed them to create elaborate deceptions that exploited their victims' passionate interest in musical history. As the mountain operation continued, surveillance teams reported increased activity at the cabin. Smoke from the chimney suggested that documents were being burned, creating urgency for the tactical teams preparing to move against the location. The destruction of evidence could eliminate crucial information about additional victims and the full extent of the criminal network. The breakthrough in the mountain operation came when a park ranger reported seeing a vehicle matching the description of Rodriguez's escape car on a remote trail approximately 5 miles from the cabin. The sighting suggested that Rodriguez was preparing to abandon the cabin and make a final escape attempt through the wilderness. This intelligence prompted an immediate tactical response to prevent his escape. The tactical teams approached the cabin using specialized equipment designed for operations in difficult terrain. The remote location meant that backup support would be limited, requiring careful coordination to ensure both the safety of law enforcement personnel and the successful apprehension of Rodriguez and his associates. As the teams moved into position around the cabin, they observed signs that the occupants were aware of their presence. Windows had been covered with blankets, and smoke continued to pour from the chimney at an unusual rate, suggesting that the destruction of evidence was accelerating. The situation created a critical decision point for the operation commanders. The intelligence picture became clearer when intercepted radio communications revealed that Rodriguez was attempting to contact associates outside the immediate area. The communications suggested that additional members of the criminal organization remained at large and were prepared to provide assistance with Rodriguez's escape. This revelation indicated that the criminal network was more extensive than previously believed. The final phase of the cabin operation began when tactical teams confirmed that Rodriguez was attempting to leave through a rear exit that led into dense forest. The terrain made pursuit extremely difficult, but also limited Rodriguez's escape options to a few established trails that could be monitored by law enforcement personnel. The confrontation that would finally bring Anthony Rodriguez to justice was about to unfold in the remote wilderness of the Cascade Mountains, 36 years before a chance discovery would provide the final piece of evidence needed to fully understand the scope of his criminal enterprise and its devastating impact on the collector community. November 24, 1987, Cascade Mountains, March 15, 2023, Seattle, Washington. The final confrontation with Anthony Rodriguez occurred during a snowstorm that transformed the mountainous terrain into a treacherous landscape of limited visibility and dangerous conditions. Rodriguez had attempted to escape through a network of hiking trails, but the severe weather forced him to seek shelter in an abandoned ranger station approximately 2 miles from the cabin. The building's isolation worked against him when tactical teams surrounded the structure at dawn on November 24th. Rodriguez's capture marked the end of a criminal enterprise that had operated across multiple states for over 6 years. The evidence recovered from the cabin included detailed records of the counterfeiting operation, financial documentation showing the distribution of millions of dollars in profits, and most importantly, a confession letter that Rodriguez had apparently been preparing before his planned escape. The letter provided investigators with crucial information about additional victims and the location of evidence that had not been recovered. The confession revealed that the criminal organization had victimized at least 18 collectors across 7 states, with Robert Mitchell being among the final targets before law enforcement intervention ended the operation. Rodriguez described the evolution of the scheme from simple theft to systematic elimination, explaining that the decision to begin killing victims had been driven by the increasing sophistication of authentication methods that threatened to expose their counterfeiting operation. The trial of Anthony Rodriguez and his associates became one of the most significant criminal cases in Pacific Northwest history. The evidence presented during the proceedings revealed the full scope of the counterfeiting operation and its devastating impact on the collector community. Rodriguez was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of murder, fraud, and racketeering, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The closure of the case provided answers for the families of the missing collectors, but also revealed the extent to which the criminal organization had corrupted the legitimate rare recording market. Hundreds of counterfeit recordings remained in circulation, and auction houses were forced to implement new authentication procedures to prevent similar fraud in the future. Jennifer Mitchell attended every day of Rodriguez's trial, finally learning the details of her husband's final hours and the circumstances that led to his death. The evidence showed that Robert had been targeted specifically because of his expertise in identifying authentic recordings and his reputation for thorough research. His knowledge had made him a threat to the counterfeiting operation that Rodriguez could not afford to ignore. The investigation's conclusion seemed to mark the end of a dark chapter in the history of music collecting, but the story would gain new significance 36 years later when collector David Harrison made his remarkable discovery. Harrison, a retired music teacher from Portland, had been building his collection for over 20 years when he purchased a box of vintage recordings from an online auction in early 2023. Among the recordings Harrison acquired was an unmarked reel-to-reel tape that appeared to be a demo recording from the late 1960s. When Harrison played the tape on his restored vintage equipment, he initially heard what seemed to be an unreleased session by a local Seattle band. However, as the tape continued, Harrison realized that the recording contained something far more significant than undiscovered music. The final minutes of the tape contained what appeared to be a conversation that had been recorded accidentally when the original session ended. The voices on the recording were discussing financial arrangements and future meetings in terms that suggested illegal activity. More importantly, one of the voices mentioned specific details about rare recordings and collectors that matched information from the Rodriguez case files. Harrison contacted the Seattle Police Department, and the tape was forwarded to Detective Sarah Coleman, who had taken over cold case investigations from the retired Detective Parker. Coleman immediately recognized the significance of the recording and contacted FBI agent Morgan, who had maintained oversight of the Rodriguez case even after the convictions. Forensic analysis of the tape revealed that it had been recorded at Soundwave Studios in 1973, making it one of the final sessions before the studio closed. The conversation captured on the tape provided evidence of early planning for what would eventually become Rodriguez's criminal enterprise. The voices belonged to Rodriguez and an associate discussing their plans to acquire the studio's archives and begin producing counterfeit recordings. The discovery of the tape prompted a renewed investigation into the Rodriguez network, leading to the identification of additional associates who had escaped prosecution in 1987. Several individuals who had been considered minor participants in the original case were revealed to have played more significant roles in the criminal organization. New charges were filed against 3 individuals who were still alive, providing additional closure for the families of victims. The tape also revealed the existence of additional burial sites that had not been identified during the original investigation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of locations mentioned in the recording led to the discovery of remains belonging to 2 collectors whose disappearances had never been connected to the Rodriguez network. These discoveries brought the total number of confirmed victims to 21 individuals. The resolution of the case demonstrated how technological advances and persistent investigation could provide justice even decades after crimes were committed. The digital enhancement techniques used to analyze the 1973 recording would not have been available to investigators in 1987, highlighting the importance of preserving evidence for future analysis. For Jennifer Mitchell, now 78 years old, the discovery of the tape provided a final chapter to her husband's story. The evidence confirmed that Robert had been targeted for his expertise and integrity, validating her belief that he had died trying to expose criminal activity. The knowledge that additional perpetrators had been brought to justice provided a sense of completion that had been missing since the original trial. The case of Robert Mitchell and the vintage record store murders serves as a reminder that justice can transcend time, and that the dedication of investigators and the persistence of concerned citizens can eventually bring truth to light. The sophisticated criminal enterprise that Anthony Rodriguez created was ultimately undone by the very expertise and passion of the collector community that he had sought to exploit and destroy. The final evidence that closed this decades-long investigation came not from advanced forensic techniques or sophisticated police work, but from the simple act of a music lover playing an old recording and recognizing that something important had been preserved in its grooves. Sometimes the most significant discoveries are hidden in the most unexpected places, waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets.